Hi, today we are going to see hooks again, in particular in the context of instance hooks and classes for the case of instantiation. So we are going to discuss and think about hooks. What are the granularity of hooks? So there are big hooks, small hooks, so they will allow us to do different things. We will put in practice hooks in the case of instance creation to understand in particularly factory methods. And we are going to talk about how do we customize instance creation and if we do it or not. So let's start with an example. So here we have a piece of code. This piece of code is, in the case of a visitor, actually that is anecdotic here. But what here is happening is that every time that we're going to visit something, we're going to instantiate a new scope, store it, use it, and then do something with it. Return it or not. Now, let's imagine that I want to change the kind of scope I want to instantiate here. So what are the different solutions that I have? One possible thing to do is to extract the class into its own method. Yeah, so instead of hard coding the class there and sending you to the direct class, I can make a method that returns the class that I'm going to use and send new to the result of this message. So, of course, this can only be done in languages where classes are first-class objects like Pharo, Python, Ruby. You are not going to be able to do it in Java. But this solution is already something very good, and we can already work on this. So, the first clear conclusion of this solution is that we can create subclasses of our class, like for example, we can have CHInterpreter2 that can redefine that method and use a different class. So now we are able to extend our implementation by just redefining our class and redefining just one little method. One alternative solution to that is, instead of redefining that class using a message or using actually a subclass, is to store that class into an instance variable. Like that, every time that we create an interpreter, we can tell it what is the scope class it's going to use. And then every time that we are going to access the class that we want to instantiate, we just need to use this variable. This design will allow us to change the kind of scope we're going to use per instance and not per class. So this is actually much more flexible. Now, what happens if we want to have a more complex instantiation? Like, for example, actually what happens here is that we are taking the class and we are sending message new. So this message new is going to instantiate the class and configure it with default values of its instance variables. But what happens if, for example, this instance is actually a really complex object and we wanted to instantiate and configure a really complex graph of objects inside the scope? So actually what happens here is that maybe instead of new, what we wanted to do is to send a different message with parameters or something like that. But here we cannot actually do it because maybe one scope actually doesn't need all that, and another scope, yes, it does need that. So that means that actually the hook at this level is not enough. It's really too small. So maybe we can do better. Another solution is to, instead of actually just extracting the class that we're going to use, we can extract the entire creation of the scope. And like that, we just extracted the creation of the object to a separate method, but now this method becomes overridable, and then a subclass can decide to exchange this object instantiation and configuration by a completely different implementation. Now, if you can only pass a class, if we only keep the original hook, the problem is that we cannot customize object instantiation. Languages where classes are first-class objects, we can do really strange tricks to do it. Yes, it is possible, but actually the solution at the end is not very nice. So the last solution that I showed you helps you to customize and access different protocols depending on the kind of scope that you want to instantiate. Now, a different variation, a final variation for this pattern is that we can also extend this hook with parameters. So we can add a parameter to the hook. Like that, we can send arguments here, and then each subclass can redefine this and use the argument as it pleases. In a conclusion, having class hooks is nice because they help us redefine instantiation of objects, but it's important to think about the granularity of those hooks. So the bigger the hook, it's probably the more difficult to reuse code, but also it is more easy to redefine some part of the system that are more complicated.